Sam was 9 years old and small for his age. He lived with his grandmother Rose in a little stone cottage at the edge of the village of Millbrook. The cottage had a low wooden gate, a crooked chimney that let out thin curls of smoke every morning, and a garden that Rose had kept alive for more years than Sam could count. There were tomatoes growing along the south wall, rows of herbs that smelled sharp and clean after rain, and tall sunflowers that leaned toward the light like they were listening to something far away. Sam loved that garden. He loved it the way quiet children love quiet things. Every morning before the village fully woke up, Sam would pull on his boots, take the old watering can from beside the back door, and walk out into the garden alone. He liked the stillness of early morning. He liked the way the grass was wet with dew and the way the air smelled like soil and green things growing. He would water each plant slowly and carefully, moving from row to row without rushing, talking softly to the tomatoes and the herbs the way his grandmother had taught him. Rose always said that plants grew better when you spoke kindly to them. Sam believed her. One morning in early spring, while he was pulling weeds near the old oak tree at the far end of the garden, his fingers touched something hard beneath the soil. He stopped and dug around it carefully. It was smooth and heavy and almost perfectly round. He scraped the dirt away and lifted it out with both hands. It was a stone. Or at least it looked like one. It was gray all over, the color of a cloudy sky, and it was heavier than any stone Sam had ever picked up. Its surface was perfectly smooth, not rough or cracked the way garden stones usually were. There were no sharp edges anywhere on it. It fit into both of his hands together like it had been made to be held exactly that way. Sam turned it over slowly. He looked at it from every side. He did not know what it was. He only knew that he liked it. He carried it to the center of the garden and set it down near the herb patch where the morning light hit longest and strongest. He stepped back and looked at it sitting there on the dark soil. It looked like it belonged there. Like it had always been meant to sit in that exact spot. He decided to keep it. That evening he told Rose about the stone over supper. She listened and nodded and told him it was probably just a river stone carried in by an animal long ago. She did not go out to look at it. She was tired that evening and her knees hurt from the cold. Sam ate his bread and soup and thought about the stone until he fell asleep. The next morning he watered his plants the way he always did. When he reached the stone he stopped. He looked at it for a moment. Then without really thinking about it he tilted the watering can and let a small stream of water pour over the top of it. The water ran down its smooth sides and soaked into the soil around it. Sam watched it and felt something he could not name. Something that felt like the stone was glad. He shook his head and told himself that was silly. But he did it again the next morning. And the morning after that. Soon it became part of his routine, the same as watering the tomatoes or checking the herb rows. He would stop at the stone, pour a little water over it, and talk to it quietly the way he talked to his plants. He told it about the weather. He told it when the first tomato turned red. He told it about the boy at school who had been unkind to him and how he had not said anything back but had felt sad all the way home. The stone never answered. But it never felt like it was ignoring him either. A few weeks passed. The spring got warmer. The garden grew fuller and greener. Sam kept watering and talking and the days moved quietly the way days do in small villages where nothing very much ever happens. Then one morning Sam noticed something. He had set his watering can down beside the stone and was crouching to pull a weed nearby when his hand brushed against the stone's surface. He stopped. He pressed his palm flat against it. It was warm. Not the warmth of a stone that has been sitting in the sun. The sun had not come fully over the garden wall yet that morning. It was something else. It was a warmth that came from inside the stone rather than from outside it. A deep and steady warmth like a hand pressed against the side of a living thing. Sam pulled his hand back and stared at the stone. He put his hand on it again. The warmth was still there. He leaned down close and looked at the surface carefully. In the gray of the stone there were faint lines that he was almost sure had not been there before. They were very thin and very pale, like the cracks in old paint or the veins in a dry leaf. They curved across the surface in long slow arcs that almost looked like patterns. Sam sat back on his heels and looked at the stone for a long time. He did not tell Rose that evening. He was not sure why. He felt like the stone was a secret that was not quite ready to be shared yet. He felt like he was the only one who was supposed to know about it right now. That night he lay in his bed and thought about the warmth under his palm. He thought about how the patterns had looked like they were moving very slowly, curving toward each other like they were trying to meet in the center of the stone. He thought about how he had been watering it every morning and talking to it and how it had always felt like more than just a rock even when he told himself he was being silly. He fell asleep thinking about it. And deep inside the gray shell, deep in the dark and the warmth, something that had been sleeping for a very long time felt the water and the voice and the gentle hand. Something shifted. Something that had been still and cold and waiting for 300 years felt the warmth of being cared for. It curled tighter in the dark for just a moment, the way a sleeping creature curls when it feels safe. Then it stilled again. But it was not as deeply asleep as it had been before. Something was waking up. Very slowly. Very quietly. The way the most ancient things always wake. Not with noise or light or any great sign. Just a slow turning toward warmth. Just a small and steady moving toward the voice that had been speaking kindly every morning without asking for anything in return. Outside the cottage window the stars were very bright. The garden was still and dark and the stone sat in the center of it, warm in the cold night air, its pale patterns glowing just faintly enough that if you had been watching closely you might have seen them. But no one was watching. No one yet knew what was sitting in the garden. No one yet knew what Sam had found. 3 days after Sam first felt the warmth, the patterns on the stone grew darker. They were no longer the faint pale lines he had noticed before. Now they were deeper and more clear, curving across the gray surface in long slow arcs that caught the morning light and held it. They were the color of old gold, not bright and shiny but deep and rich, like the color of honey held up to a candle flame. Sam traced one of them with the tip of his finger and felt a faint vibration beneath the surface. Not a shaking. Not a trembling. Just a soft and steady hum, the way a sleeping cat hums when it breathes. He pulled his finger back and looked at it. Then he looked at the stone again. He watered it the way he always did and talked to it quietly and then went inside for breakfast without saying anything to Rose. But Rose noticed things. She always had. She came out into the garden that afternoon to cut some herbs for supper and stopped when she walked past the stone. She stood looking at it for a long moment without saying anything. Then she crouched down slowly, her knees clicking the way they always did, and looked at the golden patterns on its surface. She did not touch it. She just looked. Then she stood up and went back inside. At supper that evening she was quiet. Sam watched her from across the table. She ate slowly and did not talk about the garden the way she usually did. She looked at her bread and her soup and said nothing for a long time. Finally she said, "Sam, how long has that stone had those marks on it?" Sam told her he had first noticed them a few days ago but that they seemed to be getting stronger each morning. Rose was quiet again. She wrapped both hands around her cup of tea and stared at the table. She said, "I do not think that is a stone." Sam waited. She said she did not know what it was but that it did not feel right to her. She said she had lived a long life and had seen many things in gardens and fields and she had never seen a stone that grew warm on its own or carried golden marks that deepened day by day. She told Sam she wanted him to stop watering it until they understood what it was. Sam nodded but said nothing. The next morning he watered it anyway. He could not explain why. It did not feel like disobedience. It felt like something he had to do the way you have to keep a promise even when keeping it is hard. The stone felt like it needed the water. It felt like it needed his voice. And Sam was not the kind of boy who walked away from something that needed him. He poured the water slowly over the top and watched it run down the golden lines and soak into the dark soil below. He said, "Good morning." The hum beneath his fingers was a little stronger than the day before. It was 2 days later that the traveler arrived. He came into Millbrook on foot, which was unusual. Most travelers came by cart or horse along the main road. This man came from the direction of the eastern hills, walking with a long wooden staff and a large pack strapped to his back that was so full of books and papers it leaned to one side as he walked. He was not old but he was not young either, somewhere in the middle, with a brown coat that was dusty from the road and sharp eyes that moved quickly over everything they saw. His name was Hugh. He stopped at Rose's gate because he was thirsty and asked if he might have some water. Rose was a kind woman and she told him to come in and sit down and she would bring him tea. Hugh thanked her and came through the gate and followed her along the path toward the cottage door. He stopped when he saw the stone. He stopped so suddenly and so completely that it looked like something had reached out and grabbed him by the shoulder. He stood very still with his staff in one hand and his eyes fixed on the gray object sitting in the center of the garden. Sam was nearby pulling weeds and he watched the man go still and felt something tighten in his chest. Hugh said quietly, "Where did you find that?" Sam told him. He told him about finding it near the old oak tree, about how heavy it was, about how he had started watering it every morning and talking to it. He told him about the warmth and the patterns and the hum. Hugh crouched down in front of the stone and leaned very close without touching it. He looked at it from one side and then the other. He looked at the golden lines with an expression on his face that Sam could not fully read. It was not fear exactly. It was something bigger than fear. It was the look of someone who had spent a long time looking for something and had walked around a corner and found it when they least expected it. Then very gently Hugh pressed one hand flat against the stone's surface. He closed his eyes. He stayed like that for a long moment. Then he opened his eyes and looked up at Sam and said, "This is not a stone." Rose had come back out with the tea and was standing on the cottage step. She said she had already told the boy as much. She asked Hugh what it was. Hugh stood up slowly. He looked at them both. Then he said the word carefully, like it was something fragile. He said, "It is a drake egg." The garden was very quiet. Rose set the tea tray down on the little wooden table beside the door and sat down in her chair without saying anything. Sam looked at the stone. He looked at it with new eyes. He thought about how it had felt under his hand every morning. He thought about the warmth and the hum and the way the golden patterns moved like they were alive. He thought about how he had always felt like something inside it was listening. Hugh pulled his pack off his back and opened it and drew out an old book with a dark cover and pages that were brown at the edges. He flipped through it carefully until he found what he was looking for. He held the page out so Sam could see it. There was a drawing on the page, old and faded, of a smooth round egg covered in curved golden markings. It looked exactly like the stone in the garden. Hugh told them that drake eggs were believed to be gone from the world. The last recorded hatching had been over 300 years ago. He said that drake eggs did not hatch like bird eggs. They did not need heat from a flame or warmth from a mother. They needed something rarer and harder to find. Rose asked what they needed. Hugh looked at Sam. He said they needed to be cared for. He said a drake egg would stay dormant forever unless something living chose to tend to it. Chose to water it and speak to it and return to it each day without being asked. He said the egg did not wake because of heat or light or time alone. He said it woke because it felt safe. Sam looked at the egg sitting in the dark soil of the garden, its golden lines deep and warm in the afternoon light. He thought about every morning he had come out alone in the quiet and poured water over it and talked to it about small and ordinary things. He had not known what he was doing. But the egg had known. And somewhere deep inside the shell something pressed very gently outward, just once, like a small hand testing the wall of the world it was about to enter. Sam woke before the sun that morning. He did not know why. There was no sound that pulled him out of sleep, no light through the window, nothing he could point to and say that was the thing that woke me. He simply opened his eyes in the dark and lay still for a moment and then knew, the way you sometimes know things without being able to explain them, that he needed to go outside. He pulled on his trousers and his boots without lighting a candle. He moved quietly through the cottage so he would not wake Rose. The floorboards creaked once near the kitchen door and he stopped and waited and then moved on when he heard nothing stir. He stepped out into the garden. The sky was that deep dark blue that comes just before the first gray light of dawn. The stars were still out but fading at the edges. The air was cold and clean and smelled like wet soil and grass. The garden was completely still. The sunflowers stood dark and straight along the wall. The herb rows were quiet. The old oak at the far end was just a shape in the darkness. And in the center of the garden the egg was glowing. Sam stopped walking. The golden patterns on the surface were no longer just deep and warm. They were lit from inside, pulsing slowly with a soft golden light that pushed through the gray shell like firelight through a paper lantern. The whole egg breathed with it, brightening and dimming, steady and slow like the heartbeat of something very large. Sam walked toward it slowly. He crouched down in front of it and looked at it and did not feel afraid. He felt the way he always felt in the early morning garden, quiet and still inside, like the world had slowed down to a pace he could keep up with. He reached out and rested his hand gently on the top of the egg. The warmth hit him immediately, not the soft steady hum of the past weeks but something much stronger, a deep rolling heat that moved up through his palm and into his arm and filled his chest. The egg was trembling under his hand. Not shaking. Trembling. The way something trembles when it is trying very hard to do something it has never done before. Sam pressed his hand a little firmer and said, "It is all right." He said it the same way he said it every morning. Quietly and without drama, the way you speak to something you have been speaking to for a long time and have come to know. Then the first crack appeared. It started at the very top of the egg, a thin dark line that split the golden pattern cleanly down one side. Sam heard it, a small sharp sound like a twig snapping underfoot in winter. He did not pull his hand back. He stayed very still and watched. Another crack appeared beside the first. Then another. The line spread slowly across the surface, following the curves of the golden patterns like the patterns had always been showing where the shell would one day open. Pieces of gray shell began to fall away, dropping into the dark soil below, and with each piece that fell the golden light grew stronger and warmer and filled more of the garden around him. Sam sat back on his heels and watched. It took a long time. Long enough for the first pale gray light of dawn to begin at the edges of the sky. Long enough for the birds in the old oak to start their first quiet sounds. Long enough for Sam's knees to ache from crouching and for the cold air to make his fingers stiff. But he did not move. And then the shell fell open. It did not explode or shatter. It simply split apart in 4 clean pieces and fell outward into the soil like a flower opening, and in the center of where it had been there was a small wet creature curled tightly into itself, shaking very hard, its eyes pressed shut. It was no bigger than a cat. Its scales were dark gray, the same color the shell had been, but along its spine and across its small folded wings there were streaks of deep gold that caught the morning light and held it. Its tail was thin and curled around its own body for warmth. Its legs were tucked underneath it. Its head was bowed down against its chest. It was shaking so hard Sam could see the trembling from where he crouched. He did not think. He simply did what he always did. He held out his hand. He held it low and open, palm up, the way you hold your hand out to a small animal you do not want to frighten. He did not move closer. He did not make any sudden sound. He simply held his hand out and waited and said, in the same quiet voice he had been using every morning for weeks, "Hello." The small creature stilled. Slowly, very slowly, it lifted its head. Its eyes opened. They were gold. Not yellow, not amber, but true deep gold, bright and clear and full of something that was not quite animal and not quite anything Sam had a word for. They found his face immediately. They did not look around the garden or up at the sky. They went straight to Sam and stayed there. For a long moment nothing moved. Then the small drake uncurled itself on unsteady legs, stumbled once, caught itself, and walked directly to Sam's outstretched hand. It pressed the top of its head against his fingers the way a cat pushes into a hand it trusts. Sam felt the warmth of it against his skin and the small strong pulse of its heartbeat through its skull. He let out a long slow breath. He said, "Hello Cinder." He did not know where the name came from. It was just there, the same way some things are just right without needing a reason. Cinder pressed harder against his fingers and made a sound low in her throat, not quite a growl and not quite a purr but something between the two. Sam sat down fully in the soil of the garden with the broken shell around him, and Cinder climbed into his lap and curled there and closed her gold eyes and went still. He sat with her while the sun came up. He sat while the garden lightened around him and the birds grew louder in the oak and the first smoke began to curl from cottage chimneys across the village. He sat while the dew dried on the grass and the sunflowers turned their heads toward the morning and the whole quiet world of Millbrook began to wake up. He was still sitting there when Rose opened the cottage door. She stopped in the doorway. She looked at Sam sitting in the middle of the garden with a drake curled in his lap, its gold-streaked wings folded against its sides, its small chest rising and falling in sleep. She put her hand over her mouth and said nothing. And then came old Walter from next door, who had come to return a garden tool and who stopped dead at the gate with his mouth open. And then his wife Edith, who had followed him and who let out a sharp cry and grabbed his arm. And then others who heard the cry and came to look, and more behind them, until there was a crowd of people pressed against Rose's garden gate staring at the boy and the creature in his lap. The fear moved through the crowd the way fire moves through dry grass. People stepped back. People grabbed their children and pulled them close. People spoke in fast low voices and pointed and shook their heads. But Sam did not look up. He kept his hand resting gently on Cinder's back and felt her breathe and did not look up at any of them. He was right where he was supposed to be. They came on the third day. 3 of them arrived in a large black carriage that rolled through Millbrook in the early afternoon and stopped in front of Rose's cottage. The horses were tall and well fed and the carriage had a brass seal on its door that caught the sunlight and threw it across the garden wall. The people of Millbrook stopped what they were doing and watched from their doorways as the 3 officials climbed out and straightened their dark coats and walked to Rose's gate without looking at anyone around them. The one who spoke first was a tall thin man named George. He had pale eyes and a very straight back and he carried a leather folder tucked under one arm. Behind him was a woman named Ruth who wrote everything down in a small notebook without looking up. The third was a younger man named Percy who stood slightly behind the other 2 and said nothing at all but watched everything very carefully. George knocked on the cottage door. Rose opened it. She looked at the 3 of them without any expression on her face and then stepped aside and let them in. Hugh was already inside. He had been staying in the village since the morning the egg hatched, sleeping in the room above the inn at the end of the lane. He had spent the past 2 days going through his books and papers and writing long notes in the margins. When the 3 officials came in and sat down at Rose's kitchen table, he was already sitting there with a stack of old books in front of him and his arms folded. Sam was in the garden with Cinder. George opened his leather folder and laid several papers flat on the table and began to speak in the careful flat voice of a man who had said official things many times before. He said that the council had received reports of a drake hatching in Millbrook. He said that drakes were classified as a protected and dangerous species under regional law. He said that the council had a responsibility to ensure public safety and that the creature would need to be transferred to a controlled sanctuary outside the city where it could be properly housed and studied. Rose said, "She is not a creature. She has a name." George looked at Rose and then back at his papers and continued speaking as if she had not said anything. Hugh said quietly that he would like to see the specific regulation being applied here. George slid one of the papers across the table. Hugh looked at it and said nothing. George stood up and said they would need to see the drake now. They went out into the garden. Cinder was lying in the sun near the herb patch with Sam beside her. In 3 days she had already grown noticeably. She was longer than a cat now, lean and quick, her dark gray scales drying out from their hatchling softness into something that caught the light differently, harder and smoother. The gold along her spine was brighter in the sunlight. Her wings, still small and folded, twitched occasionally when something moved nearby. She was asleep when they came out. She did not stay asleep. The moment George and the others came through the cottage door and into the garden, Cinder's eyes opened. She lifted her head. She looked at the 3 strangers and the gold of her eyes went very dark and she made the low sound in her throat that Sam had learned meant she was uncomfortable. Sam put his hand on her back and she stilled a little but kept watching. George stopped at a safe distance and looked at Cinder with the expression of a man performing a task he found unpleasant. He told Sam that the council had authority to take the drake into care and that Sam should step back. Sam did not move. He said, "She will not hurt anyone." George said that was not something a child could determine and that Sam needed to step away from the animal. Sam looked at him and then looked at Cinder and then slowly, because he did not want to cause trouble for Rose, he stood up and took 3 steps back. What happened next was something none of the 3 officials forgot for a very long time. The moment Sam moved away, Cinder rose to her feet. She went from lying flat and still to fully upright in less than a second. Her wings spread open, still small but wide enough to make her look suddenly much larger than she was. The low sound in her throat became something louder and sharper. She turned her head toward George and Ruth and Percy and her gold eyes locked onto them with an intensity that made all 3 of them step back without deciding to. George said very carefully that someone needed to restrain the animal. Nobody moved toward her. Cinder took 1 step forward. Just 1. And that was enough. Percy actually bumped into the garden wall behind him. Ruth stopped writing in her notebook. George's straight back was not quite as straight as it had been. Sam said quietly, "Can I go back to her?" Nobody answered, so he walked back to her anyway. The moment he was beside her, Cinder folded her wings. She pressed herself against Sam's legs and the sound in her throat dropped back down to the low hum. She looked up at him once and then looked away at the garden wall as if the 3 strangers were no longer worth her attention. The garden was very quiet. Hugh had been watching from the cottage doorway. He walked out now and stood between Sam and the officials and said that he would like to show them something before anyone made any further decisions. He went back inside and came out carrying one of his old books, the one with the dark cover and the brown-edged pages. He opened it to a page near the back and held it out to George. He said, "Read the 3rd paragraph." George took the book and read. His expression did not change much, but something shifted behind his pale eyes. He handed the book to Ruth without speaking. Ruth read it and stopped writing in her notebook. She handed it to Percy, who read it and then looked at Cinder and then at Sam. Hugh explained what the text said in plain language for the benefit of everyone present. He said that according to every recorded account of drake bonding in the known history of the subject, a bond formed in the first hours after hatching was permanent in nature. He said the drake would recognize its bonded human as the single fixed point of its world. He said that separating a newly bonded drake from its human did not make the drake safer or calmer or easier to manage. He said it made the drake dangerous. Not aggressive in the way of a wild animal protecting itself. Dangerous in the deeper way of a creature that has lost the one thing that makes the world make sense to it. He said the records were very clear on this point and that 2 of the 3 documented attempts to separate bonded drakes from their humans in the past had ended badly for everyone involved. George looked at the book again. He looked at Cinder pressed against Sam's legs, calm and golden in the afternoon light. He looked at the 3 steps of distance he had asked Sam to take and what those 3 steps had produced. He closed his leather folder. He said he would need to send a full report to the council and that the situation would require further review. He said that in the meantime the boy and the drake would remain together under observation. He said this as if it were his own decision and not the only reasonable conclusion the last 10 minutes had left him with. Hugh said that sounded very sensible. Rose said she would put the kettle on. Sam sat back down beside Cinder in the afternoon sun and she pressed her head against his shoulder and closed her gold eyes and the warmth of her was steady and calm against his side. He did not feel like he had won anything. He just felt like things were the way they were supposed to be. The weeks that followed were the quietest and the fullest of Sam's life. Quiet because nothing dramatic happened. No more officials in black carriages. No more crowds at the garden gate. No more arguments at the kitchen table. The village of Millbrook settled slowly into the strange new fact of the boy and the drake the way villages settle into most things, first with fear, then with curiosity, then with a careful kind of acceptance that stopped just short of warmth. And full because every single day brought something new. Cinder grew fast. Much faster than Sam had expected. In the first week after the hatching she went from the size of a cat to the size of a large dog. Her dark gray scales hardened fully and lost the last of their hatchling softness, becoming smooth and close-fitting and very slightly reflective, so that in bright sunlight she seemed to shimmer at the edges. The gold along her spine deepened from the pale streaked gold of a new thing into something richer and more certain, a deep warm gold that caught even the weakest winter light and held it. Her wings grew too. Slowly but steadily, unfolding a little more each week, the thin membrane between the bones becoming less translucent and more solid. She could not fly yet. But she stretched them in the garden each morning with a kind of focused seriousness that made her look much older than she was. Sam watched all of it. He watched the way you watch something you love, closely and quietly and without wanting to miss any part of it. Hugh stayed in Millbrook. He had meant to stay only a few days but a few days became a week and a week became several and by the time anyone thought to question it he had already moved his books and papers from the inn room into Rose's front room and become a fixed part of the cottage's daily life. Rose did not object. She fed him at her table and he fixed her garden gate and chopped wood without being asked and they got along in the easy way of two older people who have both lived enough life to know what is worth making a fuss over and what is not. Every afternoon Hugh taught Sam about drakes. They sat at the kitchen table with books spread open between them or they sat outside in the garden with Cinder nearby and Hugh talked and Sam listened the way he always listened, completely and without interrupting. Hugh told him about drake history, how they had once lived across the whole of the known world, how they had been neither tame nor wild but something in between, intelligent enough to choose their bonds and strong enough to honor them. He told Sam about the old accounts of drake keepers, the men and women throughout history who had been chosen by drakes and what their lives had looked like. He told Sam that a bonded drake would grow to reflect the nature of its keeper. Sam asked what that meant. Hugh said it meant that Cinder would become, in large part, what Sam showed her. Patient keepers had patient drakes. Brave keepers had brave drakes. Cruel keepers, in the rare and unhappy cases where such bonds had formed, had drakes that the old records did not describe kindly. Sam looked at Cinder lying in the afternoon sun with her wings half open and her gold eyes moving slowly across the garden. He thought about that for a long time. He started paying closer attention after that. Not just to what Cinder did but to what he himself did around her. He made sure he was calm when he felt like being impatient. He made sure he was gentle when he was tired. He made sure he always came back to her when he said he would. Small things. But Hugh had said it was always the small things that built the large ones. Cinder noticed. Sam was sure of it. She was not an animal in the way the village dogs were animals. There was something behind her gold eyes that understood more than it should have. When Sam was sad she pressed close without being called. When he was worried she lifted her head and looked at him steadily until whatever was tight in his chest loosened a little. When he laughed she made the low humming sound that he had come to understand was her version of the same thing. Rose watched all of it from the cottage doorway. She watched in the mornings when Sam brought Cinder her water and talked to her while she drank. She watched in the afternoons when Hugh and Sam sat in the garden with books and Cinder lay between them with her tail curled around Sam's ankle. She watched in the evenings when the light went gold and long across the garden and Sam leaned against Cinder's side and neither of them moved for a long time. One evening Rose came out and sat in her chair beside the cottage door and called Sam over. She put her hand on the side of his face the way she did when she wanted him to listen carefully. She said, "Do you remember what I always told you about speaking kindly to the plants?" Sam said he remembered. She said, "It is the same with everything. Kindness does not shout. It does not demand. It just keeps showing up every morning and doing the small thing that needs doing. And after a long time something hears it. Something always hears it." She looked at Cinder. She said, "You called something very great toward you, Sam. Without knowing it. Just by being the kind of boy you are." Sam did not say anything. He was not good with words when things felt too large for them. But he took Rose's hand and held it for a moment and she understood. The letter from the council came on a gray morning near the end of the month. Hugh read it first and then set it on the table in front of Sam without saying anything. Sam read it slowly. It was long and full of official words but the meaning at the center of it was simple enough. The council had reviewed all records and testimony submitted by Hugh regarding the Millbrook-Drake bonding. They had consulted their oldest archives. They had reached a formal decision. Samuel of Millbrook was hereby recognized as Drake Keeper, the first to be so named in 312 years. The title carried with it certain responsibilities regarding the care and conduct of the bonded Drake. It also carried certain protections. No authority under regional law could separate a recognized Drake Keeper from his bonded Drake. The bond was to be considered permanent and legally protected in every territory under the council's reach. Sam put the letter down on the table. Hugh was watching him. Rose was watching him. Even Cinder had lifted her head from the garden outside the window and was looking at him through the glass with her steady gold eyes. Sam said, "Nothing changes though. Does it?" Hugh said, "No. Nothing changes. It just means the world has caught up with what was already true." Sam nodded and went back outside. That evening he sat in the garden with Cinder while the sun went down and the sky turned from orange to deep blue and then to the full dark of a clear night. The stars came out one by one the way they always did. The village was quiet around them. Rose had gone inside. Hugh's lamp was lit in the front room window. Sam leaned against Cinder's warm side and looked up at the sky. Cinder was still beside him, her breathing slow and even, her gold spine catching the starlight. She had grown large enough now that leaning against her was like leaning against something solid and permanent, like a wall that chose to be warm. Then Cinder lifted her head. Her ears came forward. Her gold eyes opened wide and fixed on the sky above the eastern hills. She went very still in the way that meant she was listening to something Sam could not hear yet. And then he heard it. Far away, so far it was almost not there, a sound came across the open sky. Long and low and rolling, rising at the end into something that was almost a note, almost a word, something old and without a name in any language Sam knew. A drake call. Then another, from a different direction, further north, answering the first. Then silence. Cinder made a sound low in her chest that Sam had never heard from her before. It was not the humming and it was not the warning sound. It was something older than both of those. Something that came from a part of her that had been waiting just as long as the egg had waited in the dark soil of the garden. She answered them. Her call went up into the night sky over Millbrook, over the cottage and the garden and the old oak tree, up into the cold clear air above the village, and carried out across the hills and the dark fields to wherever those other voices had come from. Sam sat beside her in the garden where it had all begun and listened to the sky fill slowly with sounds that had not been heard in 300 years. He did not move. He did not need to. He was exactly where he was supposed to be,